Gela Kasla, Nicolas, Siwidi, Gayukalaka, Laichwitach. My name is Sequoia. I come from the Laichwitach First Nations of Turner Island. Gela Kasaki. This song I'm about to sing is a Haley Gala. It belongs to Tuma Smith of the Laichwitach. Gela Kasla. Ayo.
How did you get to be here staying at the Haig Brown House?
A few years ago, I can't remember exactly what year it was, 2 or 3 years ago, Alan Haig Brown suggested that I be the keynote speaker for the Haig Brown Festival. And so I accepted, and I actually came and stayed. My husband and I and my daughter came and stayed 2 or 3 nights here at the Haig Brown House, and got to know about it and about the writer-in-residence who lives here from November to April for 5 months out of the year. And they encouraged me to apply to the Haig Brown House as a writer-in-residence, and so I did. And they already had someone for last year, so I applied and was accepted for this year. So that's how I ended up here.
Awesome. How's your stay been so far here?
Oh, it's been great. It's a great old house. I mean, it's an old house and it has its problems, but where it's situated right on the river is awesome. The grounds are awesome, and just the people in Campbell River. Yeah, it's been a great stay.
Do you have any other favorite Indigenous authors?
Favorite Indigenous authors, I've read a lot of books by Indigenous authors, and there weren't so many before, but now there are a lot more than when I was growing up. Well, actually, when I was growing up, there were none that I knew of, and so I didn't have any books to read. Now their children's books are coming out, and a lot more authors that are Indigenous, so that'd be great. I don't know if I have a favorite one. I really like Thomas King's work, and Thompson Highway, and a few others, but I'll tell you a funny story about Thomas King. He and I were up for the same award, the Burt Awards, and I got a list of who was up for the awards, and I told my daughter, and he wrote The Inconvenient Indian. Well, he's written a lot of books, but we were up for this particular award, and he had The Inconvenient Indian, and I had They Called Me Number One. And I told my daughter, oh, I'm not going to win. Thomas King is up for the award. He's going to get it. And without skipping a beat, she tells me, oh, don't worry, Mum. He's just the inconvenient Indian. You're number one. So I told that story when we were at the awards ceremony. I told that Thomas King was in the audience, and he found it so funny, and he sent my daughter a book, signed a book and sent it to her. So I think there are a lot of books out there, so many to choose from now.
Do you have any books you would recommend?
Well, for little children, I mean, there's one my cousin wrote, Willie Sellars. He wrote dip netting with Dad, but that's more the interior culture rather than the coastal culture. So it would be good, you know, for the coastal children to learn how we fish up there, you know. But there's some other ones that I don't. The titles don't come to mind right now, but I see them. You know, I go into bookstores and I see children's books and other books. There's so many that I could recommend, but yeah.
What opportunities have you gotten since you've written your book?
Wow, you know what? Writing this book opened up a whole new world for me. And it really surprised me because I had written the book and not knowing, I went into the literary world not knowing anything about it. And my husband and my daughter helped me. I wasn't very good in English. You know, my sentence structure and everything was not very good. So the concepts, you know, and what I wanted to say, I put down on paper, but then they would help me with the grammar and everything. And they turned it into a book. And anyway, when the book came out, apparently there was 800 sold before it even came on the market, which surprised me. And I didn't know, and I was asking the publisher, well, is that good? You know, because I had nothing to compare it to. I guess it's very good, but I didn't know that. And then all of these awards, the publisher would phone me and say, you've been nominated for this award. Okay, all right, thank you, and hang up the phone and quickly run to my computer and look it up and see what it is. So I had no idea, but I've been across Canada. I've been in the United States. I've been invited to Oregon. I've been invited to Washington. I've been all over BC. I've been right across Canada in Ottawa and Toronto, Winnipeg, everywhere, Calgary, Edmonton. I'm going up to Atlin this summer. Because I'm a writer, I ended up here at the Haig Brown House. So it just has opened up a whole new world for me, and it's a great world to be in the literary world. Mm-hmm.
So what have you learned from this experience?
I have learned from this experience that people really want to hear from Indigenous authors. I'm amazed when I go out. My husband and I went and spoke in Seashell. There were 450 people that came to hear us. And they're so appreciative because it's not their experience, and you know, everybody's talking about reconciliation, but they don't know what they need to do, you know, and they don't know the Indigenous experience. And you know, it's by writing about our experiences, we're sharing with them so they can share with others. So all of these myths about Native people getting everything for free, and you know, all Native people are on welfare and we're there, you know, because, you know, on reserves because we want to be there. All of those myths, you know, we have to correct that. And by writing the books, people from Indigenous people, and before there were books written about Indigenous people, but not by Indigenous people. They were written by mostly white people, but they can't get that experience of living the life. And so Indigenous people can really get into the depth of why, you know, we have the social problems. And so that's what I've learned, is that people are hungry for more writing from Indigenous people.
Can you share a bit about your family?
I was raised in the most northern Seguapan community. I have just above us, our tribal area ends just north of where I am, and then the Carrier people are from there, and my grandmother is Carrier. And so I am familiar with the Carrier people and the Seguapan people, even though I was raised in the Seguapan territory. There were 13 of us. My mom had 13 children. I've lost 3 brothers. My mom is still alive. She's going to be 93 in April. I was raised by my grandmother the time that I was home, and she died in 1997 at the age of 101.
What does it mean to be First Nations to you?
To To be First Nations to me is very important. I'm very proud of being First Nations. I know all of the contributions that our people in North, Central, and South America have contributed to the rest of the world. And it's too bad that too many of our youth think that they don't have a place in society. And then, you know, the myth is that we were waiting on the shores, waiting to be rescued. And that isn't true at all. When the newcomers got here, we helped them to live on the land because everything was new to them. You know, the foods, they didn't know what foods to eat. They didn't know what animals they could eat. They didn't know what plants they could use. And so the Indigenous people helped them to adapt to this land. And, you know, the myth about the newcomers hacking their way through North, Central, and South America is just that. It's a myth because it was already laid out, totally laid out for anybody to go anywhere with a guide. And Aboriginal people had trails. They had, you know, the riverways that they had their canoes and their kayaks that they went with. And actually, a lot of the major roads today are built on original Indigenous trails. So Indigenous people helped the newcomers when they got here. Unfortunately, we didn't have any immunity for the diseases that were brought as well, so that was kind of the downfall, and that started the chaos that was now still exists in our community today, but we have so much to be proud of. We have so much to be proud of.
What do you remember about your culture from before residential school?
Before I went to the residential school, we basically lived on the land, and I think I was very fortunate to be able to get the tail end of the really older people living out on the land. In the summertime, we traveled by horse and wagon. We would take the wagon if we were going to be camping out. A lot of times my grandmother and I just took horses and went to where we were, whether it was a berry picking spot or we were going out for something else. My grandfather, we would go out and camp for a week at a time, and he would get hunt deer or moose, and then we'd dry it out in the bush. The fish as well. My grandmother would fish trout from the lakes, and she would dry it out there. And then we would go down to Soda Creek down by the river, and then we would get salmon out of the Fraser River and dry that as well. So it was a very happy, solid home that I was raised in. It was great.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up, in a town it's called Williams Lake now. I grew up just north of there. That's where my home community is, and I also grew up just south of there for the majority of my time because that was where I spent my time at the residential school. So yeah, in and around Williams Lake I grew up. Not in, around Williams Lake. Yeah.
And what is one of the best memories you have while growing up?
One of the best memories I have, oh my goodness, 40 below in the wintertime, being in a nice, warm, cozy house for Christmas. We used to go home for Christmas, 2 weeks at Christmas. We were allowed 2 months, the months of July and August, we were allowed to go home. And then we were also allowed to go home for 2 weeks during Christmas. And back then, it used to get cold, really cold. And so it would be 40 below, and we would be in a nice, the house was never cold. Everybody, you know, my uncles and my brothers and my grandparents would keep the house toasty warm. In the daytime, my brothers would go out looking for old discarded plywood and make sleds out of that. We would make tunnels under the snow. Up there, the snow would be really deep, and then it would kind of melt, and then there would be a crust on the top, and we could burrow in under the snow and make tunnels all over. And then the thing about being home at Christmas and in the summertime was we were allowed to associate with anybody we wanted. we could talk to our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, anybody in the community. There were no restrictions, where at the residential school we were separated from our siblings. The boys were on one side, the girls were on the other side, and I very rarely saw my older sister because she was in the senior girls dorm and I was in the junior girls dorm. So it was such a special time, and we had Christmas, and we had a big dinner on Christmas. There were no presents, but we didn't miss it. It was just so magical being home for that little bit. And then all too soon it was over and we had to go back to the school.
So what was the biggest thing that inspired you to write your book?
Well, I wanted to write it for my for the younger generation, so they could understand why there was so much chaos with their older relatives. Because I remember, people, the younger kids, why is my dad like that? Why is my mom like that? And they didn't understand, and it's, we didn't talk about it. Like, I would talk to my grandmother, my mother, about the residential school, because I didn't have to explain to them where all the hurt came from. We understood each other, and we would talk amongst ourselves, and it was like we were a part of a secret society, but I didn't talk to my kids about it, and Graham didn't talk to, others that hadn't gone to the school, because when people would start asking us questions, then you got to the really hurt part of who you were, and then I had a hard time. I would start crying, and so we just didn't talk about it. So so our that's why I wrote it, is so that they would understand. And it was really good, because before the book was published, and I let one of my nephews read the book, and his comment to me after he read it was, well, now maybe I can forgive my dad for some of the things he did, because then he understood where his dad was coming from and why he was like the way he was. So that was good. So that's the main reason I wrote it. And then later on, the added bonus was to teach the non-Aboriginal people who knew nothing about residential schools.
How difficult was it to write about painful memories?
It was very difficult to write about painful memories, and in the book I say I cried enough tears to fill a swimming pool. But it was also very therapeutic, because in writing about it, and it took me about 20 years to write the book, because I had to put it away because it was so painful. I would start thinking of things and just be crying, and just having to go back and relive that was really difficult. But it helped me to take it out and examine it, and connect the dots from my childhood to my adult life, and understand why I was the way I was, and how my childhood affected my adult life. And so it allowed me to examine it and put some meaning and reasoning to it, and help me to change the way I was. So it took me a long time, but it was very therapeutic for me to write the book.
What advice could you give other authors in this regard?
Well, I would just encourage them to write, like, even if they decide to burn it, like I have a sister that she said, I don't want anybody reading my notes. I don't want my kids reading it. I don't want my grandchildren reading it. And I said, well, they don't have to. And many people don't need to publish it. They don't need to make it public, but they need to get it down and to examine where they've been, and like why, what are they trying to fix in their life, and take it out and look at it and turn it over and examine it, and understand it. And so that's what I would say. And if you want to burn it at the end, then burn it. At least you will have gotten it out and had a real good look at it.
Can you tell us about your next book?
My next book is going to be, first of all, I want to examine the ways that Aboriginal people had to go underground to keep their human rights and their rights for their traditional lands alive. And I give the example of when I was in the Stalo Nation, where this elder was telling me about when the priest would come in to say mass, and some of the older people didn't speak English, and so the priest asked the chief to translate the mass for them. But instead of translating the mass, he was talking about the rights that, you know, the human rights and the indigenous rights that they had to keep alive. And so because it was against the law for 3 or more adults to gather in one space except for religious or family purposes. So that's part of the book that I want to write about. And there are stories like that right across Canada of how Indigenous people had to go underground to keep their rights alive. And the other part is BC, I think, celebrated its birthday a few years ago, and they held up Simon Fraser, you know, like Simon Fraser, the great explorer, discovered the Fraser River. But what they didn't say is the role that the Indigenous people played in that. And it was the carrier people, my grandmother's people, that guided him down to the Seguapum territory. And it was our chief from Soda Creek that took Simon Fraser and guided him down and turned him over to the Statlium. And if it weren't for our people, for the guides, for the medicines, for the plants, for everything, the canoes, Simon Fraser would have never made it. But yet, when they celebrate that, they don't say that. And so I want to bring those stories out. And again, right across Canada, there are stories of how the Indigenous people helped the newcomers to maneuver the land and the territories.
What advice could you give young First Nations?
The advice I would give would be for young First Nations people to really understand the tremendous contributions that our people have made to the rest of the world. North, Central, and South America have so many things. The Indigenous people have contributed in the way of medicines, in the way of government, in transportation, everything. There are so many things that our people have contributed to the rest of the world. And if there's one piece of advice I would give to the younger people is find out about all of the contributions, and that will change the way that you feel about yourself. Sure did for me.
Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you bet. Well, you know, with young people like you, I think our future is bright, and it really encourages me when I see young people like you coming out and doing things like this, and I thank you for doing the work that you do. Thank you very much.
So, so Wakaya, Kashtia, Hama, Hama, my, Hama, my, Hama, Hamu, my, Hamu, Hamaye, Kashia, Ilaka, so, Hamu, my, Hamu, Hamaye, Kashia, Ilaka, so, Hama, my, Hama, my, Hama, Hama, my, Hama, my, Hama, Hamu, my, Hamu, Hamaye, Kashia, Ilaka, so, Hamu, my, Hamu, Hamaye, Kashia, Ilaka, so, Hama, my, Hama, my, Hama, Hama, my, Hama, my, Hama, Black Nuba, kill, do, quila, Hawaii glue, qualaki, fly, kill, do, quila, and got so white, Hawaii glue, qualaki, fly, bak, lanusi, wa, my, my, like Nuba, kill, do, quila, Hawaii glue, qualaki, fly, kill, do, quila, and got so white, Hawaii glue, like so, bak, lanusi, wa.